Hey guys, today I'll show you a zombie horror thriller TV series named The Walking Dead: The Ones Who Live. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with a flashback of 6 years ago when Rick, a former sheriff's deputy, blew up a bridge teeming with zombies to save his teammates. Everyone thought he perished in the explosion, but little did they know, Rick was rescued by a mysterious group. This group is responsible for safeguarding a hidden city that still functions normally. Security and secrecy are their top priorities, so no one is allowed to leave without permission. With no other choice, Rick became a provisional citizen of this secret city. Until he has made enough contributions to earn full citizenship, he, like many others, is sent on the most dangerous missions. But Rick has no desire to settle down here. His thoughts are always with his wife, Michonne. Whenever an opportunity arises, Rick tries to escape. One day, amidst chaos, he seizes what he believes is the perfect chance. Without hesitation, Rick raises an axe and hacks at the chain binding his left hand. To avoid being caught by the guard on the other end of the chain, he endures excruciating pain as he thrusts his severed hand into the flames to cauterize the wound. After stopping the bleeding, Rick desperately flees into the forest. Unfortunately, his strength gives out, and the guards capture him once again. When Rick wakes up in the hospital, despair overwhelms him. 6 years fly by. Rick, still a provisional citizen, has been doing the hardest and most grueling work. He's attempted to escape many times, but each attempt ended in failure. Anyone else would have been mercilessly executed by the military long ago, but Donald, the head of the guard, admires Rick's resilience and courage. Not only does Donald cover up Rick's escape attempts, but he also repeatedly offers him a place in his squad. However, Rick's determination remains unchanged. He will escape one day. Donald, well aware of Rick's nature, approaches him after he completes another zombie-killing mission and reminds him that no one has ever tried to escape from the hidden city. After all, in this post-apocalyptic zombie world, there's nowhere to run. Rick's expression grows solemn. He knows this might be the safest place left on Earth, but what's the point of surviving if he can't be with the one he loves? Then, one day, Rick's bald friend rushes over to share good news. After 3 years of hard work, he's finally become a full citizen and is about to move into the city to work in water and electricity maintenance. For him, it's a dream come true because with change comes endless possibilities. His words strike a chord with Rick, who finally agrees to Donald's offer and joins the city's guard. The military even fits him with a prosthetic left arm. After a month of adaptation training, Rick's combat skills are stronger than ever. But the real reason he joined the guard is crystal clear. The more missions he undertakes outside the city, the greater his chances of escape. One day, Donald pulled Rick and a girl named Pearl aside for a private conversation. Both of them were recruits he had personally selected from the pool of provisional citizens, unlike most of the other soldiers who were chosen from among the city's permanent residents. Donald wanted to bring some fresh change to the army, so he planned to promote the two of them to squad commanders. Rick understood what Donald was really after. He wanted to build his own loyal faction. Pearl didn't mind. She had served in the South African Navy and knew she would have been zombie food long ago if it weren't for Donald. But Rick's main concern was still how to escape. He had no interest in getting involved in power struggles. Pearl warned him not to daydream since Donald wasn't someone you could easily fool. Just as Rick was about to be promoted to squad commander, Major General, a top military official, came to speak with him personally. It turned out that besides the hidden city, there were 2 other smaller cities, Portland and Omaha. These 3 cities were considered allies, but none of them knew the locations of the others. Major General wanted Rick to keep the city's secrets no matter where he ended up, emphasizing that this was the very reason the military was established. However, Rick wasn't swayed by Major General's grand rhetoric. His focus remained on his escape plan. As he gained access to more information, a perfect escape plan began to take shape. One day, Rick visited his bald friend who worked in water and electricity maintenance in the city. Since his friend knew Rick had been planning to escape for a while, he quietly pointed out a sewer route that led outside the city and even gave Rick the code to disable the electronic barriers. Rick was genuinely grateful. After days of waiting, Rick finally saw his chance. This time, his squad was tasked with clearing out an abandoned chemical plant on the outskirts of the city. Rick deliberately found a zombie with a severed left arm and placed his own dog tags on it. As Donald claimed, if there was no escape for the living, then Rick would fake his death instead. His plan was to detonate a bomb among the zombies and then slip away through the sewers, completely unnoticed. But just as he was about to throw the grenade, Rick saw a little girl standing in front of him. He had no choice but to abandon his escape and rescue her first. To make matters worse, Pearl heard the commotion and rushed to his aid. Rick had to beg her not to stop him from escaping. Pearl urged him not to be foolish. Donald knew everything about him. Even if he escaped, he and Michonne would have nowhere to hide. Anger surged within Rick, and he immediately went to confront Donald in his quarters, demanding to know exactly what Donald knew. Donald revealed that he had uncovered everything: the messages Rick had sent in a bottle, the contacts stored on his phone, and all the sketches he had drawn. He even had a pretty good idea of where Rick's loved one might be. Rick was furious, realizing that Donald had been watching him and his muscles so closely. Rick had always seen himself as just a small player, uninterested in the fate of the city, but Donald suddenly erupted, pinning Rick to the ground. Donald revealed that he had once led an airstrike that bombed 3 cities, killing thousands, including his own wife. In this post-apocalyptic world, everyone had their own burdens, and only by becoming strong could they have the freedom to choose their own path. Donald insisted that if Rick stayed and continued to fight, he would be securing a better future for his wife and daughter. Seeing Rick's hesitation, Donald pressed his advantage, offering him and Pearl a major assignment: converting a university into a frontline base, where all the high-ranking officials would eventually hold a summit. It was the fastest way to earn distinction. Back in his quarters, Rick was still unsure how to respond when Pearl rushed in, urging him to turn on the TV. It's reported that one of the last 3 remaining cities on Earth, Omaha, had fallen. Initial reports suggested that the collapse of the perimeter barrier had led to the disaster. Rick knew zombies couldn't have caused this. It had to be the work of a powerful force. Both he and Pearl suddenly understood why the military kept the locations of the cities such a closely guarded secret. But Pearl's next words sent a chill down Rick's spine to his smelly butt, realizing that the little girl he had rescued was actually from the city of Omaha. She had survived by hiding under her parents' bloodied bodies, escaping the zombies' notice. She had witnessed helicopters destroying the city's outer barrier. Pearl felt fortunate to live in a city with such strong military defenses and urged Rick to reconsider his escape plans. As Rick watched the news replay of Omaha's fall, he finally understood what Donald had meant. Only by becoming strong could he protect the ones he loved. The next morning, Rick burned all the letters he had written to Michonne. He decided to put everything aside for now and fully commit himself to the upcoming mission. That day, Rick picked up Donald to inspect the progress of the base's latest renovations. Donald noticed that Rick had become more reserved lately, which in his eyes made him seem more fitting for a leadership role. Rick didn't respond, but instead began talking about his childhood. His father was a simple, honest farmer, but to save their failing farm, he burned their crops to the ground. In the end, they received substantial compensation, and the enriched soil led to a bountiful harvest the following year. From that experience, Rick learned that even the most straightforward person will change when pushed by circumstances. Donald nodded in approval, pleased to see he hadn't misjudged Rick. Suddenly, an arrow pierced the helicopter's body, striking Donald. In the next moment, an explosion tore Donald to onion pieces, and the helicopter lost control, crashing straight to the ground. Fortunately, Rick and the others were unharmed. But before they could react, rockets began exploding among the group. Rick was left dazed and disoriented. As he regained his senses, a long blade swung towards him, but both he and the attacker froze when they saw each other's faces. It was Michonne Rick had been searching for all this time. After 6 long years, Rick and Michonne have finally reunited, but shockingly, Rick is pointing a gun at her. To understand why, we need to go back a few months. While searching for Rick, Michonne rescued a couple from a horde of zombies. Impressed by her skills, the couple's tribe leader invited her to stay and live with them. However, Michonne politely declined, explaining that she needed to head north to find someone important. Just then, a short, angry man burst into the office, scolding the tribe leader for not rescuing his best friend. But when he realized the couple was safe, he was overwhelmed with gratitude toward Michonne. Despite his unassuming appearance, this man was the tribe's linchpin, an expert in weapons and ammunition. Hearing that she was headed north, he warned her to be cautious, as the zombies were migrating south, and the person she was looking for might already be gone. But Michonne wasn't deterred. 6 years ago, when Rick blew up the bridge swarming with zombies, everyone assumed he was dead as pieces of shit. But she never lost faith that her husband was still alive, especially after finding a note in a cabin indicating Rick was headed to a shipyard. Determined, she set out on her journey to find him. Knowing she was set on leaving, the short man not only provided her with a horse and armor, but also gave her a secret weapon designed specifically for large hordes of zombies. Michonne promised to return after reuniting with Rick, and with heartfelt farewells, she set off. Not long after, she crested a hill and saw a massive horde of zombies advancing across the plains. It was too late to find another route, so she took out the secret weapon. As the shells flew, brilliant explosions lit up the zombie horde, drawing them towards the blast. But one zombie, covered in gasoline cans, caught fire, and the resulting explosion sent Michonne flying like a giant Barbie toy. Her Ferrari horse bolted in terror like a speeding Tesla, leaving her to face the zombies with only her blade. Just then, a bright purple light erupted from both sides of the plain, and a deafening roar filled the air, creating a path through the zombie horde. It was the short man's tribe coming to her rescue. With the zombies now redirected, the survivors no longer needed to hurry south. During the celebratory feast that night, the tribe proudly explained that the massive explosion was the short man's masterpiece, filled with chemicals that kept the fire burning for hours. The short man, unusually humble but never short of weapons, admitted that it was one of his lesser inventions. Since they hadn't found a suitable location to settle, the tribe decided to accompany Michonne on her journey north for a while. The next morning, the group set out in a grand procession, loaded with supplies. As they passed through an abandoned town, the roar of helicopters suddenly filled the air. Before they could react, shells rained down, filling the streets with thick yellow smoke. Coughing and covering their noses, Michonne and her companions fought their way through a few zombies blocking their path and finally took refuge in a nearby store. The smoke from earlier was definitely toxic. Everyone felt parched, struggling to breathe, with the curly-haired friend even starting to foam at the mouth. Once the smoke cleared a bit, Michonne forced herself to drag some medical supplies back from the pharmacy. Unfortunately, her curly-haired friend had already turned into a sexy zombie, but remained curly-haired. She had no choice but to put her friend down herself. To make matters worse, the curly-haired friend's boyfriend also didn't make it. Michonne had to use her blade again, stabbing him with all her strength. The short man was also in bad shape, suspecting the smoke contained chlorine gas, which can cause respiratory failure. Michonne urged him not to give up on the medical treatment, as the oxygen masks in the medical kits could help alleviate the symptoms. After months of recovery and conditioning, the two finally overcame the effects of the poison. However, Michonne couldn't find any joy. Even though she had faced countless life-and-death situations, the deaths of that couple still weighed heavily on her. She had just saved them not long ago, only to end up having to kill them herself. The short man was also deeply affected and short of words, as the couple had been his best friends. Michonne suggested he not follow her, offering him a map to Alexandria. But the short man refused. He was determined to find out where the helicopter that killed his friends came from, with revenge burning in his eyes. Early the next morning, the two set out north together. Michonne, out of habit, captured a one-armed zombie to serve as a pack mule. Before long, they finally reached their destination, the bridge shipyard where Rick was supposed to be attacked. But the sight that greeted them drained the color from Michonne's face. Piles of charred bodies littered the ground, clearly wiped out by some powerful force. If Rick had been here, there was little chance he survived, especially after she found his boots in a backpack. Overwhelmed with grief, she broke down and cried like a giant baby. Despite not wanting to believe it, she had to face the possibility that her lover was dead. The short man tried to comfort her, using his words only but not his short muscles. He encouraged her not to give up. Since the bodies were burned, it's likely others escaped alive. He suggested they check the nearby survivor camp. Michonne had never considered life without Rick, as searching for him had become a habit over the years. With no better plan, she followed the short man's short advice. While passing through a forest that day, they heard the familiar sound of helicopter blades overhead. Looking up, they saw the same helicopter that had dropped the gas bombs before. Without hesitation, the short man pulled out his homemade launcher, aimed, and fired a missile, then quickly launched a second one. The helicopter plummeted to the ground like a broken kite. As a few soldiers in black uniforms scrambled out, the short man fired more rockets, sending them flying like shattered adult toys. Michonne wasn't idle either, charging in with her blade. Just as she prepared to deliver a killing blow, she removed the attacker's helmet and froze. The face beneath was Rick's. Both stood there in shock, unable to believe they had encountered each other like this. After 6 long years, the couple embraced tightly, but without a smelly hormone yoga session in front of the short man. Rick regained his composure quickly. Now wasn't the time for a hormone reunion because more troops were on their way. They couldn't escape in time, so the only option was for Michonne to pose as an innocent survivor. Once back in the hidden city, Rick promised he'd find a way to get both of them out. The short man, confused by the situation, was about to ask what was going on when a bullet pierced his chest, coming from a soldier who had survived. By the time Rick finished off the soldier and returned, the short man was dead, with his short life ended. Rick placed the blade in the short man's hand to explain the soldier's wounds later. Then he raised his gun and told Michonne to act like a helpless captive. Soon, helicopters swooped in, and Michonne was taken back to the hidden base. After several rounds of interrogation, she flawlessly recited the story Rick had concocted, and as expected, she passed without issue, ending up as a cleaner at the base. Rick later took her to an empty warehouse where they shared a years-awaited intimate moment together. 2 minutes later, as expected, they finished their intimacy. Then, they recounted their experiences over the years, with Michonne expressing her disgust at the soldiers who dropped gas bombs on innocent survivors. Rick remembered what the late Donald had said about the need for change within the Guard. There was a special unit of red-suited soldiers who carried out covert missions and returned covered in blood. Even Rick had no idea what they did. Now, as a small-time squad leader, Rick had no power to prevent such tragedies, let alone know about them. Michonne, hardened by years of loss, didn't bring up avenging her short friend. Her only wish now was to go home with Rick, who promised that day would come soon. It was clear that whatever brainwashing Donald had tried on Rick had completely failed the moment Michonne reappeared in his life. After parting ways with Rick, Michonne climbed to the highest point of the base, surveying the ground below filled with heavily armed soldiers. Avenging her friend seemed impossible, and even escaping would be a daunting task. To make matters worse, when Rick returned to his quarters, he encountered an unexpected visitor, an old acquaintance, Jadis. While others at the base might not know Michonne's identity, Jadis knew all too well. However, she had no intention of reporting them. Instead, she warned Rick not to cause trouble, or he and Michonne would meet a terrible end. Jadis's relationship with Rick has always been a mix of friendship and rivalry. They once worked together to fight the Saviors, but Jadis betrayed him. Eventually, she faced her own downfall. In Season 9 of the original show, when Rick blew up the bridge to stop the zombie horde, Jadis saw the smoke from afar. As she was about to call for a helicopter to leave, she spotted Rick washed ashore by the river, leading to the scene where she rescued him at the start of this series. This connection ties up a major loose end from the original show. Despite being a woman in a harsh world, Jadis has managed to survive by aligning with the powerful hidden city. Her complicated history with Rick explains why she didn't expose him and Michonne. Fully aware of Rick and Michonne's history, Jadis sternly warned him not to attempt an escape. The city has a strict rule: once you're in, you don't get out. Even if they managed to flee, the military would hunt Rick down to his community, putting everyone there at risk. Enraged, Rick even threatened to slit her chicken throat to silence her, but she was prepared. She revealed that she had hidden information about Rick and Michonne among her personal belongings. If anything were to happen to her, the military would surely discover it. A deep sense of helplessness overwhelmed Rick. He watched from a distance as Michonne methodically cut down approaching zombies. He didn't want her to follow in his footsteps and become just another city reaper. The two of them silently passed by each other, not knowing how much longer they'd have to endure this unspoken separation. The scene shifts to Major General holding a memorial service for the late Donald in front of all the troops. Although Rick wasn't particularly fond of the officer who had promoted him, Pearl felt differently. She vividly remembered how Donald had saved her shitty life in a desperate situation. If not for him, she would have been long dead. Suddenly, Major General appeared. Before his death, Donald had strongly recommended both Rick and Pearl. With a warm smile, Major General handed Rick a book and then invited Pearl to join him in his car. Rick had a bad feeling about this. That night, Pearl unexpectedly announced that Major General had promoted her to commander. She would be taking over Donald's role as leader of the city's guard, while Rick would be sent to work at a newly established forward base. Sensing Rick's concern, Pearl repeatedly emphasized the importance of the forward base, where all the high-ranking officers and frontline troops would eventually gather. But Rick's worry wasn't about that. It was the fact that Major General had started asking questions about Michonne. Why would someone so high up be interested in her, considering the Reaper unit had 17,000 soldiers? Pearl made it clear that from now on, they needed to distance themselves from Michonne. It turns out that when Michonne first arrived, she was assessed as having a Type A personality, meaning she had strong convictions and leadership potential. The military usually sends such people to the most dangerous places to eliminate any potential threats to stability. Upon hearing this, Rick immediately sought out Pearl, hoping she could protect Michonne, just as Donald had once protected him. Despite her reluctance, Pearl agreed out of old loyalty, but as a newly promoted commander, she couldn't risk her position for a stranger. Rick's anxiety grew. Without Pearl's protection, Michonne's life was in constant danger. He had to get her out of the city as soon as possible. After a night of planning, Rick secretly slipped her a note, instructing her to start the escape that night. Michonne's heart raced as she approached her locker, finding a map Rick had hidden there, along with instructions to meet in the bushes by the river. The escape route was filled with scattered zombies, but Rick had already blocked them off, allowing her to reach the meeting point without issue. But when she arrived, Rick was nowhere to be seen. Steadying herself, she found a note from Rick in the Tesla boat without battery. He explained that this was the only way for her to reunite with her children, and he had to stay behind to ensure the military didn't pursue her. Her hands trembled as she read the note. The next morning, Rick set about covering Michonne's tracks. He approached Jadis, asking her to help fake Michonne's death, promising to fully commit to the city if she did. Jadis agreed, though she was skeptical that Michonne would actually leave. But the next moment, Rick saw Michonne diligently cleaning up zombies, his face filled with shock. Michonne was furious, channeling all her anger into slashing down the undead with such efficiency that even her comrades were astonished. Pearl frowned, increasingly convinced that Michonne was a ticking time bomb. Frustrated, Rick pulled Michonne into a secluded corner, only to find her even more upset than he was. Despite Rick's repeated assurances that the only reason he was still alive was because of Donald's protection, and that staying with the military was the only way to ensure her safety, Michonne couldn't grasp the true danger of their situation. She believed Rick's reasoning was too flimsy, suspecting he didn't want to give up his power. After all, this place was far better than their old community. It wasn't until she stumbled upon a stall displaying phones and TV screens with images of herself and her friends that she realized the truth. The vendor could even name each person in the pictures. It was clear these were gifts Rick had prepared for them. Overwhelmed with emotion, Michonne finally understood that Rick hadn't changed at all, but she had failed to consider just how dangerous her own situation was. One day, Pearl came to see Michonne personally, inviting her to the outskirts of a deserted ruin. Pearl was still deeply troubled by the instability she perceived in Michonne's Type A personality, so she decided to probe her once again, asking why she risked everything to go into the woods and save Rick. Michonne responded with the story she and Rick had rehearsed, but the more courageous Michonne appeared, the more Pearl saw her as a threat. Noticing Pearl quietly moving her hand toward the knife at her back, Rick's heart raced. Without hesitation, he reached for his gun, ready to stop Pearl if she made a move to kill Michonne. Fortunately, Pearl decided to follow protocol, sending Michonne to the most dangerous part of the front lines. Whether she survived or not would be up to fate. 2 helicopters flew over mountains and rivers, bringing Rick, Pearl, and Michonne to the forward base. A breach had opened in the perimeter fence, and over 200 zombies had gathered nearby. The surrounding terrain was rocky, making it too dangerous to use firearms due to potential ricochets. They needed to use a sound device to lure the zombies away so that the engineers could repair the breach. Since Michonne wasn't an official soldier, she couldn't engage in combat directly. Watching Rick fight off the endless wave of zombies with only a melee weapon made her anxious, especially when Pearl struggled to move the jammed sound device. Ignoring the warnings, Michonne rushed forward to push the device towards the breach. Rick didn't stop her. Instead, he helped her push it, and for a moment, it felt like old times when they fought side by side. As the zombies fell one by one, they finally positioned the sound device correctly. With a loud beep, all the nearby zombies swarmed towards it. After a deafening explosion, the mission was nearly complete, with only a few stragglers remaining, which posed no threat. Michonne fearlessly charged ahead to finish them off, but the more impressively she fought, the more Pearl believed she couldn't be allowed to live. Pearl subconsciously raised her rifle, but Rick noticed just in time, pulling a zombie into the line of fire to block the shot. Pearl seethed with anger, regretting ever sparing Michonne. Rick could feel the genuine intent to kill radiating from Pearl, so he coldly pulled Michonne aside and told her once they got back to the city, he would send her away immediately, and he would stay here for good. As a storm raged, pounding against the helicopter, the two of them sat in silence on the way back to the city, exchanging only glances. As the helicopter shook more violently, Michonne suddenly opened the door and pulled Rick out with her. After a violent landing, they climbed up the rocky wall of a pool and managed to hide inside a nearby building. The equipment inside was still running, indicating that the occupants hadn't left long ago. As Michonne changed clothes, revealing the scars on her body, Rick felt a pang of emotion. He knew she had endured countless hardships in her search for him, but she didn't say a word about it. She was still caught up in the joy of escaping the Alliance military and was even beginning to imagine what it would be like for their family to reunite once Rick returned. Rick, however, said nothing. Sensing something was wrong, Michonne finally revealed that they had a son. She had been pregnant when Rick disappeared after blowing up the bridge, but instead of reacting with the excitement she expected, Rick shocked her by suggesting they use the radio to contact the Alliance military. Michonne couldn't hold back any longer. After all their efforts to escape the military's grasp, wasn't this the perfect time to go home? But Rick's repeated failed escape attempts had left him traumatized. He believed that even if they made it back, it would only bring disaster upon their son and friends. Rick still wanted her to leave alone while he stayed behind to ensure the military wouldn't come after their home. He knew that Jadis was too knowledgeable about them. Faking their deaths wouldn't fool her. Michonne suggested they just kill Jadis, but Rick shook his head. Jadis had already prepared all their information, ready to expose it if anything happened to her. Michonne was furious, convinced that Rick didn't want to go home because he had become too attached to his current power and position. Feeling both sad and frustrated, she took out her communicator, prepared to let him go his own way. The morning sunlight illuminated the earth, and the two of them noticed their helicopter had crashed not far away. A smile returned to Michonne's face. Who would have thought that their impulsive leap last night would end up saving their lives? The helicopter must have crashed due to the storm, giving them the perfect cover for their escape. But Rick shook his head again, insisting that without him to negotiate with the military, they would investigate thoroughly. Michonne didn't give up trying to convince him, reminding him of another survivor, Judith, and their son back home. The hope of reuniting their family was within reach. Rick just had to take that step. When he still refused to change his mind, Michonne, filled with grief and anger, grabbed a weapon and stormed out. But after just a few steps, she stopped, realizing Rick wasn't following her. The last bit of hope she had was shattered. As she reached the building's lobby, she saw that the glass doors were surrounded by a horde of zombies. Just as she was considering how to fight her way out, an Alliance military helicopter appeared and bombed the crashed helicopter to pieces. Rick lunged forward, pulling Michonne out of the blast's path, but the explosion shattered the glass doors, allowing zombies to flood in. With no time to waste, they hurried upstairs. Michonne's spirits lifted slightly, thinking that Rick might have changed his mind. As the zombies slowly closed in, she suggested finding a place to hide, but Rick worried about getting trapped and insisted they break through. They barely made it into a laboratory when the building began to shake violently. Rick knew the Alliance military's methods all too well. They had destroyed the crashed helicopter to erase all evidence, and it was only a matter of time before they brought down the entire building. Just then, Michonne found a letter left by the building's owner, who had planned to gather like-minded survivors to build a new world. Given the advanced setup in the room, it seemed they had been close to succeeding, but something went wrong. Reflecting on this, Michonne remarked that whenever people try to save the world on their own terms, it usually ends in failure. Her words were clearly aimed at Rick, but he didn't see it that way. He believed that staying with the Alliance was the only way to protect the people he loved. But Michonne argued that the only way for Rick to truly protect his loved ones was to be with them. She couldn't understand what he was so afraid of since they faced countless powerful enemies together before. As the zombies outside began to break through the doors, Rick ended the conversation, insisting they needed to leave the building immediately. Michonne didn't respond, picking up a steel rod to use as a weapon. The two of them then burst through the doors and fought their way through the zombie horde, just like they had done in the old days, side by side. After clearing out the zombies, they were about to head downstairs when a chandelier crashed from the ceiling. Rick was unharmed, but Michonne was pinned beneath it, unable to move. The base of the chandelier was too heavy for them to lift together. As the zombies gathered in the hallway, Rick remained calm and decided to dismantle the base to lighten the load. Meanwhile, Michonne, leaning against the wall, fought off the zombies with the steel rod, but she could only buy them a little time. As the hallway filled with more and more zombies, Rick finally finished and used all his strength to lift the base. Michonne thanked him, but Rick, still cutting down zombies, replied that she never needed to thank him. The two of them returned to the homeowner's room, reflecting on their past struggles as they caught their breath. Michonne knew that Rick still wanted to go home. His missing arm said it all. But now, something seemed to be holding him back, making him hesitant and fearful. Just then, the building began to shake again. Rick insisted they leave immediately, but Michonne stood her ground. Without a clear destination, leaving would only lead to more confusion. Rick was taken aback by her determination. She was risking her life to force him to make a choice. He remembered how it felt when she walked away earlier, as if his heart had been torn open, compelling him to follow her. Michonne asked pointedly if he shouldn't want to go home with her even more. After all, the Alliance military was her enemy. When they first met, a few gas bombs had killed her friends and left her bedridden for months. That time wasn't just lost to her. It was time stolen from her family. She couldn't understand why Rick was still serving the very people who had caused her so much pain. The man before her felt like a stranger, and she desperately wanted to know what had changed him so much. With tears in his eyes, Rick finally revealed his fears. The death of his eldest son, Carl, had left him deeply scarred. During his time trapped in the Alliance, which is the largest and most powerful survivor community, he had considered suicide more than once. The only thing that kept him going were dreams where he reunited with Carl. Eventually, he began dreaming of Michonne, reliving their happy moments together, until she too vanished from his dreams. Rick was terrified that she would suddenly die, just like Carl. He couldn't imagine life without her, so he chose to retreat, believing that separating from her was the only way to keep her safe. Michonne never expected the once fearless Rick to become so timid for her sake. She took out a phone she had bought from a store, which had a picture of Carl on it. She told Rick if Carl were here, what Carl would want him to do. She reminded him of all the dangers she had braved to find him was all for them to reunite. She firmly believed that if Rick returned home, the power of love could overcome any obstacle. Finally, Rick was moved by her words. The next morning, they packed their belongings and left the room. Although the road ahead was full of zombies, nothing could shake their determination to return home. As the communicator shattered from the vibrations, Rick and Michonne climbed into the car the homeowner had left behind. The back seat was stocked with several cans of ethanol fuel, enough to keep them going for a long time. As the car roared to life, the building behind them collapsed with a deafening crash. Rick, now free from his emotional chains, had a newfound light in his eyes like a beast unleashed from its cage. Rick and Michonne decided to head back to the Alexandria colony. As they fought off zombies and enjoyed the scenic route, it felt like they were back in the early days of their journey. While passing a supply depot, Rick decided to pick out a gift for their son, whom he had never met. Michonne chose an axe for him, since Judith already had a sword. They exchanged a smile, knowing that despite all the years that had passed, their bond remained unchanged. This grueling journey through a world of thorns felt like a unique kind of post-apocalyptic honeymoon. Suddenly, they heard the sounds of a struggle nearby. It turned out that someone was being attacked by zombies, one of which had skin as tough as iron. Rick struck it with his alloy fist, barely managing to crack it, while Michonne precisely stabbed it with a steel rod, finally taking it down. The rescued strangers explained that sulfur from a nearby mountain had caused the zombies' bodies to calcify. Noticing that the strangers looked famished, Michonne offered them some noodles. However, her act of kindness only led to greed as they pulled guns on the pair, demanding all their supplies. This was a mistake. Rick and Michonne easily disarmed them, making it clear that their compassion wouldn't be wasted on ingrates. One of the strangers tearfully swore they'd never rob anyone again, so Michonne spared them, but took back the noodles and threw their guns and bullets into the woods on either side. As nightfall approached, the pair returned to the supply depot. Rick couldn't help but reflect on how long it had been since they'd enjoyed time alone like this. Then, with a smile, he pulled out a necklace he had found earlier that day. He had broken off the excess, leaving only the first letter of Michonne's name. In this post-apocalyptic world, it was practically a rare treasure. Maybe the sweetness of love made them drop their guard, but in the middle of the night, they were jolted awake by a cold voice. Jadis had somehow infiltrated the supply depot. Under the threat of her weapon, Rick and Michonne tied themselves up. Jadis calmly explained that she had suspected Rick survived the helicopter crash, so she drove to the site. Although it was now a ruin, the dead zombies and food wrappers told her everything she needed to know. Following the trail toward Alexandria, she had tracked them down. Rick was puzzled. If only she knew, why not just let them go? Jadis smiled, explaining that this was why she hadn't killed them in their sleep. She was no longer the warlord of the hilltop, but a soldier of the Alliance. Just as Jadis prepared to shoot, Rick and Michonne moved in sync, with Michonne grabbing her axe and striking. When she was about to fire the killing shot, Rick stopped her. Jadis had hidden information about the Alexandria safe zone, and if she died, the Alliance military would find it. But Michonne didn't care. She saw Jadis as the one who had torn her family apart. She floored the gas pedal, determined to end her, but during the chase, they ran into a horde of zombies. After clearing the zombies, they reached Jadis's car, only to find her gone. It turned out that Jadis had run into the three strangers from earlier, promising them safe shelter and food in exchange for a small favor. Michonne wasn't about to give up on hunting Jadis, but Rick insisted they couldn't kill her. They needed to capture her and force her to reveal where the files were hidden. Following the trail, they arrived at a cabin in the woods, only to fall into Jadis's trap. Three of the strangers surrounded them, but Rick, fed up with these ungrateful fools, attacked first, leaving the trio to become zombie chow. Jadis knew she couldn't match the combined strength of Rick and Michonne, so she raised her hands and exposed herself to the zombies. She was betting that Rick wouldn't let her die. Michonne pulled the trigger in anger, but only killed the approaching zombies. Jadis had won her gamble. She wanted to gauge how much Alexandria meant to them, and now she knew their limit. Jadis taunted them, claiming she would never reveal the file's location, so Rick should give up. He now had two choices: die here and protect Alexandria and their children, or kill her and let Alexandria be destroyed. Rick and Michonne exchanged a look, refusing to take the bait. Instead, they proposed a compromise. Michonne would return to Alexandria, while Rick would go back to the Alliance with Jadis. They would pretend nothing ever happened. After considering it, Jadis agreed that it was a reasonable plan. As Michonne threw down her weapon and left the cabin, Jadis symbolically lowered her gun as well, but as soon as Rick stepped out of the shadows, she pulled another gun from behind her back, just like she had once aimed at Father Gabriel. It turned out that 3 years earlier, Gabriel had contacted Jadis via radio, and they arranged to meet by a stream in the woods. While others resented Jadis for her past actions, Gabriel never abandoned her. He never imagined they would meet again after so many years. Gabriel urged Jadis to return to the Alexandria safe zone with him, mentioning that Rick had expressed a similar desire before he disappeared. He believed people could change. However, by then, Jadis had fully committed herself to the Alliance. She even kept Rick's survival a secret and had no intention of leaving. They agreed to meet at the same spot once a year. The following year, they met as planned. Gabriel told her that the people in Alexandria missed Rick dearly. His biggest regret was not being able to officiate Rick and Michonne's wedding. He had even prepared the rings, but Rick was killed in the explosion. Jadis quickly changed the subject, not wanting Gabriel to know that Rick was still alive. She only wanted to chat, to reminisce about the past, which helped calm her restless heart. Before they parted, Gabriel gave her one of the rings, believing it symbolized faith and hoping it might bring Jadis some clarity. In their third meeting, Jadis was more uncertain than ever and opened up about her military unit. In pursuit of more resources, they had launched an attack on a large community. The blood on her hands made her question her beliefs. Gabriel suggested that if she was unhappy, she should come back to Alexandria. He needed her. Jadis instinctively responded but quickly recoiled. How could anyone grow strong in this world without shedding blood? She soon regretted revealing so much about the Alliance military to Gabriel. Now, she had no choice but to kill him. But when she saw the calm in Gabriel's eyes, she hesitated, just as she was now hesitating with her gun aimed at Rick. As she wrestled with her thoughts, Michonne appeared with a spear. It turned out she hadn't left after all. Suddenly, a flirty zombie lunged at them, intending to have some zombie babies with these ladies. While Rick and Michonne fought it off, Jadis was bitten and pregnant. Feeling life slip away, Jadis began to explain her choices. She had once had everything, only to watch it all disappear piece by piece. She was tired of failure and had lost her way until she found the Alliance, believing it to be her true home. But why did she keep thinking about her old friends? Especially after witnessing the Alliance military's brutal methods, she had broken the rules for the first time by sparing Gabriel, who knew too much. Gabriel had told her that she had already made her choice, suggesting they meet again the next year. Only now did Jadis understand what he meant. Deep down, she still longed for Alexandria. Realizing this, she revealed where the files were hidden. Jadis didn't want anything to happen to Alexandria and urged Rick to take the files and leave. However, she also didn't want any harm to come to the Alliance, still believing it was the best hope for changing the world. But Michonne refused. They weren't just taking the files, they were going to expose the Alliance military's atrocities to its residents. She hadn't forgotten her friends who had died at their hands. If they weren't stopped, who knew how many more innocent survivors would perish? Jadis nodded with a sad smile. Her greatest dream had been to become an artist, but the peaceful world she hoped for never came. Her story was ending. She handed over the ring Gabriel had given her, originally meant for Rick. With nothing left to say, Rick raised his gun and ended the life of his former frenemy. Rick and Michonne then altered their plans, heading back toward the Alliance community. Rick knew they were in for a brutal fight, so he took out the ring and knelt on one knee, making up for the wedding they never had. Sadly, Gabriel would never reunite with the woman he loved. Only at the moment of death did Jadis confront her feelings, which is why she revealed where the files were hidden. Michonne's decision was also wise. The Alliance is nearly impossible to dismantle from within or without. Her real enemy was the military, not the community itself. Donald, who had once promoted Rick and Pearl, had intended to implement gradual reforms, but his approach was too gentle. Michonne's plan is far more direct and forceful. She aims to spark conflict between the Alliance residents and the military, forcing change. Rick and Michonne decide to return to the Alliance military, splitting up to carry out their plan. Michonne heads to Jadis's office to destroy the Alexandria files, while Rick rejoins the military to gather evidence of their crimes. Rick explains his delay in returning by saying he was struck by lightning when the helicopter crashed. Pearl is overjoyed to see him, and Rick can feel her genuine concern. Casually, he brings up the late Donald, reminding Pearl of his wish to reform the military. But Pearl, now a high-ranking commander, has long abandoned Donald's ideals. She believes that change is necessary to survive in this brutal world. Rick doesn't press the issue and follows her to the base's perimeter where Major General is waiting. The military leader is pleased with Rick's return, convinced of his loyalty, and decides to give him more responsibility, inviting him to discuss matters further in his office. Meanwhile, Michonne, now dressed in a soldier's uniform, uses the distraction caused by the zombies to sneak into the base. Following the directions Rick left for her, she easily makes her way into Jadis's office. According to Jadis's final message, the files on Alexandria are hidden there. After searching every corner, she finally finds a roll of papers inside a handmade model. To her horror, they contain detailed information about Alexandria, including Judith's name. Furious, she shreds the documents on the spot. After calming down, she collects the pieces, but just as she's about to leave, footsteps approach. A soldier enters, and Michonne swiftly kills him without hesitation. At the same time, Rick arrives at Major General's office. At Major General's request, he removes his gun and alloy fist. Major General intends to bring Rick into the inner circle. Donald had once told Rick that Major General loved using rituals to win people over. Major General begins by sharing his philosophy. Only weapons of death can bring hope for life. His principle is to eliminate all potential threats no matter the cost. When the zombie outbreak first began, Major General led his troops to abandon his hometown in favor of saving a more valuable city. Although he lost all his family and friends, he gained the resources that allowed the Alliance community to grow and prosper. Outwardly, Rick remains calm, but inside he's horrified. How cold-hearted must someone be to make such a cruel choice? Major General continues, leaving nothing unsaid. The Alliance military is divided into two parts. The unit Rick served in primarily maintains order within the city, but Major General's real focus is on the 3,000-strong frontline unit that answers only to him, carrying out the most brutal missions. All of this is supposedly to ensure the continued growth of the Alliance community. According to their experts, given the current resources and survivor numbers, humanity will be extinct in about 14 years. Major General plans to wipe out all survivors outside the Alliance community to buy more time for their own survival, giving them a chance to find a solution. He even admits that he led the mission to annihilate Omaha, one of the 3 major cities. However, since many residents of the community wouldn't support his methods, he had to cover it up with lies. Now, Major General plans to do the same to the last large community, Portland. Meanwhile, as Michonne prepares to leave the office building, she finds a toy rabbit and can't help but wonder why a soldier would be collecting children's toys. Just then, her communicator crackles to life, summoning all frontline soldiers for a pre-battle briefing. She follows the crowd to a meeting room where the next mission is being outlined. The plan is to destroy Portland's perimeter with explosives and then wipe out the population with gas bombs. However, the children are to be brought back to the Alliance community, as obedient humans are the most valuable resource in a zombie apocalypse. Michonne can't listen any longer. She abruptly stands and leaves the room, heading for her rendezvous with Rick. But after a moment of hesitation, she turns back. Rick, too, is growing uncomfortable, especially when Major General reveals that after Portland is destroyed, all the small and medium-sized communities will be wiped out as well, leaving only the Alliance community in control of the entire world. As Rick thinks of his friends in Alexandria, he tightens his grip on the knife in his hand. Major General declares that Rick could very well be the leader of the next decade. With that, he presents his ceremonial sword, asking Rick to swear an oath of loyalty, a necessary step to becoming a military commander. Rick suddenly recalls Donald's dying words. If Major General asks him to swear an oath, never do it. Without hesitation, Rick grabs his knife and leaps into action. A commander as cold-blooded as Major General would only bring ruin to the survivors. Rick originally planned to gather evidence, but he's now changed his mind. He must kill this monster himself. After successfully taking down Major General, Rick contacts Pearl via radio, arranging to meet at the base's perimeter. He's decided it's time for a serious conversation. But first, he needs to deal with Major General's body. Rick plans to transport it in a crate, but as he reaches the elevator, a soldier notices the blood seeping from the box. Rick remains motionless, tense as they ride up. On the next floor, more blood is noticed on the ground. Rick lunges at the soldier, and the two engage in a fierce struggle. Rick manages to overpower him, delivering a brutal blow with his alloy fist. As the elevator doors open, Michonne steps out, returning just in time. Both now fully aware of the Alliance military's plans, they silently agree to abandon their escape and instead focus on stopping the military's plan of destruction. Michonne has learned a lot about explosives from her late friend. She rigs all the grenades together and discreetly places them inside the frontline unit's barracks, where a large supply of gas bombs meant for Portland is stored. Working together, they position the grenades and fuses on both sides, completing their work. Rick pulls out Major General's ceremonial sword, the perfect weapon for Michonne. Then they open a plastic box, releasing the now zombified Major General and the elevator soldier. Meanwhile, Pearl has grown increasingly worried about Rick's absence. Fearing the worst, she rushes back to the office and sees the frontline troops gathering. Suddenly, she recalls the many times Rick mentioned his plans to escape the Alliance with Michonne. Realization dawns. Rick's return must have a hidden agenda. At that moment, Rick and Michonne attach the fuses to the zombies and lure them toward a specific location. Once they feel the time is right, they sprint toward the edge of the camp, only to run straight into Pearl. She's guessed correctly. Rick is up to something. She coldly orders them to undo whatever they've done. Reluctantly, Rick and Michonne turn back toward the camp, only to hear the sound of grenades being triggered by the zombies. They dive for cover under a rain tarp they had prepared. A massive explosion follows, quickly enveloping the base in gas. The 3,000 soldiers in the frontline unit don't stand a chance. Michonne, having survived a gas attack before, knew that water could neutralize the gas, so she had prepared accordingly. As Pearl approaches, Rick sends Michonne to find a gas mask while he prepares to confront Pearl in the fog. But Pearl is already wearing a gas mask, and Rick quickly finds himself at a disadvantage, even getting caught by a zombie. Thankfully, Michonne arrives just in time. With a few swift moves, she takes Pearl down, but by now, Rick is surrounded by an overwhelming number of zombies. Realizing escape is impossible, he pulls out a grenade. Luckily, the zombies absorb most of the blast, and Rick survives, albeit barely. Mortally wounded, Pearl finally sees Donald was right. She removes her gas mask and gives it to Rick. As the zombies swarm, Rick and Michonne fight desperately, barely managing to climb onto a shipping container to escape. With the death of Major General and the annihilation of the extremist frontline unit, the Alliance community establishes a supervisory committee ending the military's dominance. From now on, all actions must be approved by the committee. Major General's extreme policies are overturned, and the residents of the Alliance community are granted freedom to come and go. A new era of coexistence among survivors begins. Meanwhile, Rick and Michonne take a helicopter straight to Alexandria. Judith and her brother have been waiting for them for a long time. After all the trials they've endured, the family of four is finally reunited. Judith feels like she's dreaming, and Rick is still a bit unfamiliar with the son he's never met. But the boy has heard many stories about his father's legendary deeds from his mother, and that concludes this drama.